Yeah, as I said, I'm Katie and I'm here to talk about debugging the web. So as a little bit of an introduction, I think it is quite a difficult thing sometimes to be debugging your web applications. With JavaScript, there's not types, or if there is, they're not always quite as defined as maybe with other languages. And a lot of the time you have your front end code and back end code all mixed together in a single repo. And I think it just sometimes just makes it a little bit difficult to hunt down your bugs, basically. I do think that tests do help a lot, especially if you're testing all your different edge cases and things like that. But there's always going to be a bug that slips through, unfortunately. So there's always a need for additional methods to do some debugging. So the aim of this talk, basically, I just want to give you a nice overview of some different methods and discuss how you can use these methods to debug your applications. I want to show you that with a little bit of investment, debugging will make your life a little bit easier, and hopefully it'll just speed up the process in the future. And also just to provide some resources. Of course, this is more of a hands-on kind of slides because this isn't the kind of thing that you can learn just by listening. So hopefully after the talk, if you're maybe interested in some of these methods, you can go away and use some of the resources, use these slides to have a practice and have a go. And once you do that, hopefully you'll get more into the swing of how you do it. Now, I guess I've done this quite a high level description of how you do this debugging, because of course you can't accurately show the ins and outs of every single method and how you do everything and how you set up everything. So some of these things you might already know, but hopefully you'll learn something new. So the trusty console log. The console log is a really, really popular tool for using during the debugging methods. And I personally couldn't count the number of times that I've used it in the last couple of years. It's really helped me have a lot of sticky situations. But I've also committed it quite a few times to master, which is not ideal. So it's definitely got its downfalls as well as its pros. So here's a really simple use of console log. I've got this little function here that I just want to kind of test. It's not as part of a big application or anything. I just want to be able to check that if I put some inputs in it, it's going to give you the right output. So in this case, it's literally just adding a few numbers together and then returning the result. So we expect from this particular set of inputs that we're going to get 0. See 1, 2, minus 3 is 0. So luckily we run the program and we get 0. That's great. So the console log's done exactly what we want it to do. So here's a slightly trickier problem. For some reason, whatever reason our app requires, we want to put this formula inside our application. Maybe it's some kind of quadratic solver, or maybe we're making a maths app. So we want to convert this into JavaScript and we want to then test it. So I guess one thing to note here is there is actually 2 different answers when you do a quadratic equation, but we're just going to do just the one just for simplicity. I just wanted to find an equation that would kind of work in this scenario. So what I've done is I've just modified the previous function to do this quadratic equation. So I've just kind of converted it into JavaScript and I'm thinking, okay, cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into a calculator first and maybe online one of those online solver applications, and we're going to see what the correct answer is. And it tells me that we're actually expecting 1. So that's cool. So what I'm going to do now is just going to run my code and I've got 6. Well, that's not quite what we wanted. So there's clearly something gone wrong somewhere, which isn't great. So to do some debugging, this is how I would do it if I was wanted to solve it on a regular day. I might just put in basically a load of console logs throughout my program and split out the equation into lots of different steps so that I can kind of look and see, okay, which one's actually going wrong. So I've split it in a way that I would probably put it into a calculator, and that's what I've done. So each step I've also put in what I expect to get based on what I've done with my calculator. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run this function again and see, well, where's it actually going wrong. So we can see that we're getting the console outputs 14, 12, 2, and 6, which is way different to what we were expecting to get. But because we can see that on the second line, we're actually expecting to get 4, but we're getting 14. Well, that kind of suggests that the top line is where it's going wrong. So have a little bit of a look. Depending on kind of what the problem is, you might split this down even further so that it's really, really simple per line. But in this case, I can see that what I've actually done is I've put in the bracket in the wrong place. So that really what should happen at this top line is it should take the square root of everything. but it's only taking the square root of b to the power of 2. So there we go, there's our bug. So it's an easy mistake to have. I'm sure everyone's put brackets in the wrong place at some point, but what we can do now is we can kind of revert all of that change and put in the brackets in the right area, and hopefully now we'll get the right answer. Unfortunately, we do. That's really great. It's kind of showing us how we can use our console log to do some debugging. We did have to add some more lines and whatnot, but we did get to the right answer in the end, which is great. So the great thing about console log is it doesn't use any extra imports or libraries. You know, all you have to do is stick in a console log into your code. There's no extra like npm libraries or any of that kind of faff. It's nice and simple. Once our code was split out, we didn't actually need to add that much. As I said, it's just a console log. You know, it's nice and quick. You quite easily remember it. You don't need to, you know, get Google to kind of remember some funky syntax or anything. And if we really wanted to, we could have used one of the other console functions available, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But also, it was just really minimal. So it was quick and overall just very effective. However, it's not the quickest thing to do because, of course, depending on how big your problem is, you might have to add like 20 console logs, which again is not particularly great, and it can be quite tedious to add those, figure out which variables you want to put out, things like that. And of course, you probably want to clean these up afterwards. You know, most people don't leave their console logs into like their production applications, so you probably want to go in afterwards and delete them. And sometimes you might miss one or whatnot, so it's not always the best situation to be in. So overall, it did work for quite a simple problem, but I think if you went even bigger and you had a bigger problem that you need to solve, it's not going to be as great. As I said, there are some other fun console functions that you can use. There's this one called trace, which it kind of shows a path of the functions leading up to it. You might be familiar with this if you have come across exceptions, either in JavaScript or other languages. Our trace will just look like this. So it just shows like a nice pathway to how you got to that trace log. So it could be useful in some circumstances. We have a console assert. So this is kind of like a really simple unit test. Obviously, if you were in like a big application, you probably want your own unit tests, but maybe if you're a hackathon or you're just doing a really quick little project, you might want to throw these in as like a little test. So we can see this console assert. What we're doing is we're checking that total is equal to 10. Well, if you look at the code, we're actually going to be getting the answer as 12. So this assertion is going to fail. There is also console time, which is like a really basic performance test. You can give it a name with the console.time, and then also do the time end with the same name, and it will do a time between those two calls. So in this case, to do this like this loop, it's taken about 100 milliseconds. So again, you might not do this in a big application, but it's kind of one of those things you can have to play around with. So now we're going to talk about debugging with VS Code, which I think is a slightly improved method of doing your debugging. So I do find that in VS Code, it's a little bit more it's not more difficult, I don't think, with some IDEs, but as a beginner, I did struggle at first to find out what I actually need to press, because there's a few different buttons on this little debug screen, which you get by clicking on the little like play button with a bug. So I wasn't really sure where to click, but actually I figured it out that if you open up the debug terminal, that's kind of where you want to be. So if you click that up, it opens up a terminal within your VS Code window, a little bit like a kind of a regular terminal, but this one will have a special name, which is like JavaScript debug. And you'll kind of know that you're in the right place because this little orange bar is going to flash up, and this orange bar is going to come up every time that you run your program using this. Sorry. Every time that you run this code. So that's really cool. So, sorry, it's really throwing me off. So what you can do is just treat this like a normal terminal and run your code. And from there on, it's going to work really well. So there's a little example. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a breakpoint. So a breakpoint is a way of pausing your code so that basically you've got a line in your code that you want to test, Maybe it's a place where something's getting undefined, or you're not really sure what this variable is going to be. Of course, in this case, it's pretty simple that we know what our A, B, and C is going to be, but that's not always the case in a big application. So we can put in a breakpoint by just clicking next to the numbers. And then what will happen is when we run our code later on, it will pause at that point, and then we can do some cool stuff with it. So you do actually need to trigger these breakpoints. They're not going to just kind of work straight away. So one way you can do it is using Node. So if you're not super familiar with Node, you can just kind of run it as a file. So you just call node example.js in this case. And what will happen is the terminal will say, okay, we've seen a breakpoint in the code, let's pause it. So now you get up this like cool little menu, which is kind of all the different tools that you can use within the debugger. So on this little panel, you have a little like sideways arrow. What this will do is like fast forward to the next point. So you might have, 10, 15 breakpoints in your code, and you might just want to quickly skip to the next one. We have a little like over arrow, and that's to like jump over the lines. So you might put a breakpoint in at one point, but then actually you want to go a little bit further in the code to see maybe a bit later on what the variables are. So that's what you can do. You can step into the code, which is useful if you've got like function calls on your lines, because sometimes there's going to be points where you don't want to kind of go into the depths of loads of function calls, you just want to jump over them. But if you want to jump in to see them in more detail, you can do that. And similarly, the upwards arrow is the like jump out. We have the little green arrow, which is like a bit of a restart kind of function. And then finally, the red is just like a quit, basically, like I don't want to do any more debugging, all done. So as you can see on the left, we do have the variables that we've got in our program, which is a really nice way of seeing everything that's in your program, all of the variables that you've maybe declared so far and they've been assigned. I think that's just a really nice way of seeing really quickly how your variables are actually being interacted with, because as we saw in the console log example, we had to put like a console log for every single variable that we wanted to output. And of course, there are ways with console logs to like put multiple variables on one line, but then you have to like format it and things like that. It's not a very elegant solution. Whereas this way, you see everything so far on a nice little panel. And there is also tests. So if you're not too familiar with like unit tests and things like that, this might be a little bit more of a kind of step up to learn, but it's definitely worth it. I'm just using Jest, which is quite a nice test runner. And I've got my little test on the right, which is super simple. It's just calling my function with some values, and then it's just an assertion to say, okay, I want this result to equal 6 in this case. So what this will do is when you run the tests, which I'm just doing with running Jest, which I've got installed globally, it will hit the breakpoint just like the previous method did, and you can then step through the code and see the variables just like you could before. So it's quite a nice solution. So I think the pros of this is stepping through give you a lot of clarity. As we saw, like all of the variables were just there. We didn't need to do any extra work. And it was just very clear what all of our variables were. I didn't have to tidy up any code afterwards. Now, of course, you can see that I did add that test, which is fine to keep because, of course, as we're building out our application, we're going to be improving our unit tests. We're going to be adding more unit tests. So unless you, for some reason, wrote like a super short, like bad test that you wanted to get rid of, you're not going to need to get rid of them afterwards, which is really cool. I do think that your code looks really familiar in the IDE. I don't know if it's just me, but sometimes when I change my my color theme, my code just feels a bit different and it just doesn't feel quite the same. It takes a bit of getting used to. So I think just by able to be doing the debugging within your IDE, it just feels the most familiar. And you know exactly where all the files are, where all your functions are, which is really cool. Of course, there are some cons. I think you do need to trigger the code, which as a beginner, you might struggle with. It's fine if you've got maybe a really small application that you can just do a node run file. But if you've got like a really big application where, you've got functions calling functions inside different files, tests are going to kind of be one of the main ways you're going to have to do it, which again, tests might not always be the most appropriate thing if you're, I guess, at a hackathon or, a personal project. I do recommend tests, obviously. And there are also some limitations. I found a few times with Jest, I have had issues with using the watch function, which I think it was because my Jest was set up a little bit weird, but every now and then I do run into a bug where the JavaScript debug terminal doesn't work quite as I would expect. It doesn't properly pause the code. But yeah, generally, I think it works really well. Take a drink. Now we're going to look at debugging actually with the browser. So I've chosen Chrome tools just as it's a pretty popular choice, Chrome. But actually, it's very, very similar across all browsers. They're all pretty much the same. They're just called kind of slightly different things. But in Chrome, what it's kind of under is the Sources tab. This is under the DevTools, of course. And you can go into your page and kind of go through all the different pages in your application. So it's quite nice once you figure out actually where your files are in this view. Like, it's very easy to find which source file you may be looking for, which one you want to debug. So in this case, I've just gone to the index.txx, which yes, I'm using TypeScript for this application. And if you're familiar with React, you'll probably notice like what a normal React looks like. But yeah, obviously you can go to any single file in this view, which is really cool. So just like with the VS Code example, you can add breakpoints, and you do this by just clicking on the like number of line that you want to add a breakpoint to. You can of course add breakpoints like as many as you want for wherever you want to stop the code and have a look at the variables and whatnot. So a nice way I really like about doing this with Chrome is that you can kind of trigger the breakpoint in kind of I think a quite logical way, or at least it makes sense, I think, from a user experience. So for this example, I've just added a little breakpoint on a toggle area. So I've got like a light and dark theme kind of toggle, and I know that this code will be triggered by clicking that toggle. So what I've done is I've just put it in the middle of the function, and what I can do to trigger it is just to hit the button. So that's what I've done in this case. I've just hit that little toggle button, and it's automatically paused the code at that breakpoint, and then I can do that kind of rest of the investigation like you could do with VS Code. So if you can see on the right, I've got a whole list of variables, and there's quite a few, to be honest, because it includes like everything inside the context at the moment. So I think as a beginner, it's a little bit trickier to kind of hunt down exactly what you may be looking for. But in this case, I'm looking for my toggle state, which we can see is true. And you can kind of see that like state is quite obvious, which is nice if you're using a framework like React. So yeah, as you can see, it's quite easy to toggle the code, to trigger the code, because it's done in like the way that you expect it to. So I hit the toggle button and it's triggered the code. Now, of course, if you've got something you want to test on maybe the page startup, if you refresh the page, this will also pause the code, which yeah, I just think it makes a lot of sense, and it kind of avoids the problem of the VS Code method where you would have to find some way to maybe just trigger that file, or you'd write a test to trigger it. So as I said, the pros, it's really easy to trigger the code that you want to test. You can also see things like state, variables, and of course you can do the normal kind of functionality where you can step through the code and do all of those all of those tasks that you would expect of a debugger. I do think that it's it's not the most obvious kind of view, I think, of the actions you can do. You can see like in the top corner, the top right hand corner here, it's not the most obvious if you're a beginner and you haven't done this before, to try and figure out how do you actually like step through the code. You have to have a good look for it, if you know what I mean. But I think generally it's fairly straightforward, and you can see quite a lot, which is really good. And I said it's very similar across all the browsers. I think I've definitely used it in Firefox, and Firefox is basically the same. I think it's just got a slightly different name. But I think once you've done it in one browser, you're very kind of knowledgeable on all of them, which is really good. So some cons, I do find that like compiled and bundled code can be a lot harder to work with if you've maybe got a problem in your production app that you're trying to hunt down in this kind of fashion. It's probably going to be a lot more difficult to try and figure out exactly which line you want to pause, because chances are your code is going to be minified, it's going to be bundled up, and it's probably going to be quite difficult to try and figure that out. So you do need to usually do it using your dev environment where it's not being bundled up yet. And as I said, I do think the interface can be a little bit confusing at first. I think it'd be quite hard to see exactly what you need to know and exactly which variables are important, because it's not always the most obvious, and it's not like the menu is particularly like bolded or anything. Everything's very looks the same. So yeah, it does need to take a little bit of practice. So in conclusion, I do think that solid unit testing will avoid a lot of the common problems that you'll come across, you know, making sure that you've got really good edge cases to tackle things like things becoming undefined, variables not acting as you expect. And of course, splitting out your code into really modular chunks can help as well, instead of doing things like in massive blocks. I do think that console logs are still really good, especially if you're on a tight time and you just want to quickly have a quick look and see what could be going wrong. But it does also take that extra bit of time to add them and remove them. So in that case, it might be better to use some debugging methods using either your browser or your IDE. And I do think that stepping through your code with either of those methods is a little bit fiddly at first. And I do think it's sometimes a bit of a learning curve if you've never done it before, but I do think it's most of the time more effective, and without having to add more and more stuff to your code, you can quite quickly just jump around the files, add some breakpoints, trigger the breakpoints, and then see what your variables are doing. So it works quite well. I have added some kind of resources because, as I said, this talk is very much a, you know, this is what you can do, this is why you do it, but you really need to kind of have a practice yourself to see what it's like and see what you like and see how to do things. So I've just added a couple of different resources here, which I'll put in the chat afterwards. So one about how you can kind of use the Chrome dev tools to do your debugging, and it's got some really nice diagrams and like pictures of exactly how you do things, and a nice video as well, which is pretty much what I've covered with VS Code and Chrome. So that's it for me. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope this was useful. Hopefully your debugging will go nice and smoothly next time.